After nearly 4 decades inspecting the state's toughest construction sites, my final assignment should have been routine, no speeches, no celebration, just a quiet handover by the harbor. That's when I realized the man standing closest to me had already set a trap. Stay with me till the end, like share and subscribe if this story makes you think twice. I've spent most of my adult life doing the same thing, day after day, inspecting sites, reading reports, walking into places most people don't notice unless something has already gone wrong. 38 years with the state's Construction Safety Division will do that to you. It teaches you to respect process, to trust documentation more than promises, and to believe that rules exist for a reason, even when they slow people down. My name is Marcus Hale. I started as a junior field inspector in my late 20s. I worked my way up quietly. No shortcuts, no favors. I became known for being difficult, too strict, some said. But over the years, contractors learned something else about me. If you did the job right, I was fair. If you didn't, I didn't look away. Evan came into my life much later. He was a young structural engineer when I first met him. Mid-20s, smart, talented, and already in trouble. A failed inspection early in his career. Paperwork he didn't understand. A supervisor ready to make an example out of him. One mistake away from losing his license before his career had even started. I still remember the first time he sat across from me. His hands wouldn't stop moving. He kept explaining himself. Too fast, as if speed could make up for fear. I saw something familiar there. Not arrogance, not malice, just panic. I reviewed his case personally, spent 2 evenings going through drawings, calculations, emails. What I found wasn't sabotage or negligence. It was inexperience, sloppy oversight, the kind of mistake you fix once, if someone gives you the chance. So I did something I rarely did. I vouched for him. I signed my name under his remediation plan. I took responsibility for mentoring him through the next year. If he failed again, it wouldn't just be his reputation on the line. It would be mine. That's how it started. Over time, Evan didn't just become a colleague, he became family. He didn't have much of one. I never had children of my own. Somewhere along the way, the line blurred. I helped him get placed on state-funded projects. I reviewed his reports before submission. When he married Lena, I was at the ceremony. When he bought his first house, I helped him navigate the inspections like a proud parent pretending not to interfere. I never called him my son, but others did, and I never corrected them. For years, Evan worked hard, or at least it looked that way. He was reliable, polite, always the first to volunteer for difficult assignments. He'd stop by my office unannounced, usually with questions, or updates, or just to talk. Looking back, that's the part that makes this harder to explain. Because when someone is pulled back from the edge of failure, they tend to go one of 2 ways. Some carry that moment with them forever. It becomes a quiet compass. They remember who stood up when it would have been easier to step aside. Gratitude grounds them. Others carry something else. A sense of debt that never goes away. A feeling of imbalance. Like no matter how far they climb, they're still standing in someone else's shadow. I didn't see which path Evan was taking, or maybe I saw it and chose not to name it. When he succeeded, I felt proud. When he struggled, I felt responsible. That's the trap of silent sacrifice. You don't announce it, you don't keep score. And because you don't keep score, you don't notice when the balance starts to shift. I trusted him completely. I trusted his reports, his explanations, his timing. I trusted him with access I'd never given anyone else. Files, schedules, transition plans for my retirement. Things that required absolute integrity. I believed that the man I had pulled back from the brink would never be the one to push me toward it. And for a long time, that belief felt reasonable until it didn't. But that realization came later. Much later. At the time, standing there by the harbor, watching Evan move comfortably among the people who had worked under my oversight for decades, all I felt was quiet satisfaction. I thought I was closing a chapter. I didn't yet understand that I was standing inside the prologue of something else entirely. The first sign didn't arrive as a shock. It never does. It came quietly, disguised as responsibility. About 6 months before my retirement date was finalized, Evan started asking questions. Not unusual ones at first. He wanted to know how inspection authority would be reassigned once I stepped down, which projects would be frozen, which ones would be fast-tracked. He framed it as concern for continuity, for stability. I remember thinking, he's finally thinking like a leader. I answered what I could. I didn't notice how often he circled back to the same topic, how he always asked about timelines, never principles. Who would sign, who would review, who would be left alone once the paperwork moved on. At the time, I called it preparation. 3 weeks later, the late calls started. Not to me. At least, not always. I'd see his name pop up on my phone at odd hours, then disappear before I could answer. When I asked him about it the next morning, he laughed it off. Site issues, contractors panicking. You know how it is, he said. I did know how it was. Or at least, I thought I did. Then small things began to go missing. A set of structural drawings I remembered approving wasn't in the shared drive anymore. A report I had skimmed the week before came back with formatting changes I didn't recognize. Subtle ones, clean, professional. Easy to overlook if you weren't the one who had read the original line by line. I asked the admin team if anything had been moved. They said no. I asked IT to check access logs. They showed routine activity. Evan's name appeared often, but that wasn't unusual. He was trusted. He had clearance. So again, I chose the generous explanation. I told myself I was being paranoid. The copied signature came next. It was on a minor approval document, one I would have signed automatically, except I hadn't seen it before it went out. My name was there, the angle slightly off, the pressure inconsistent, nothing a casual glance would catch. I stared at it longer than I should have. When I brought it up, Evan didn't hesitate. Must have been a scan error, he said. Happens all the time. He even sounded annoyed, as if I were slowing things down. I let it go. That's the part people don't like to admit. Not that the signs were there, but that we actively made excuses for them, because questioning someone you love feels more dangerous than being wrong. The third sign didn't come from Evan at all. It came from Lena. It was a passing comment, said without intention. We were standing near the coffee table in their kitchen. She mentioned that things had been tight lately, that Evan had been stressed about money, that a few payments had been delayed. I remember nodding politely, waiting for the punchline. It never came. Evan had never mentioned financial trouble, not once. His salary was solid. His project bonuses were generous. I had helped him plan for contingencies years earlier. He had been proud of how stable everything was. I asked Lena what she meant. She shrugged, said maybe it was just pressure, that he didn't like talking about it. That night, I sat alone in my office long after the lights went out. I pulled up old files, compared versions, checked dates. Nothing definitive, just a pattern forming at the edge of my awareness. I told myself I was overthinking. That's what affection does when it's been practiced for too long. It dulls the alarm, turns concern into patience, turns warning signs into inconveniences. I had spent decades teaching people that safety failures rarely come from one catastrophic decision. They come from a chain of ignored signals, a shortcut here, a delay there, a signature given too easily. And still, when it was my turn, I hesitated. Because it's one thing to inspect a system, It's another to inspect a person you helped build. I didn't want to believe that someone I had pulled out of failure would ever see me as an obstacle. I didn't want to imagine that loyalty could rot quietly beneath competence and politeness. So I kept moving forward. I kept trusting. And I kept telling myself that love was the same thing as foresight. It wasn't. But I didn't know that yet. The moment everything stopped feeling like coincidence came on an ordinary Tuesday morning. I was alone in my office, reviewing the final safety packet for the harbor project. The same project that would mark my last official sign-off before retirement. I had seen versions of this report dozens of times before. Same structure, same language, same conclusions. That's why one sentence caught my eye. It was subtle. A single line about load tolerance on a temporary platform. The wording was technically correct, but the numbers were wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Just enough to lower the margin of safety without triggering an automatic rejection. I leaned back in my chair and read it again. Then again. I pulled up the previous version from 3 weeks earlier. The numbers didn't match. I checked the timestamp. The edit had been made 4 days ago, after my last review, after Evan told me everything was finalized. My first thought wasn't betrayal, it was error. I told myself someone must have made a mistake during consolidation. That happens. It's why we have layers of review. So I traced the change history. Evan's credentials were the last ones logged. I stared at the screen longer than I care to admit. The office was quiet. The hum of the old air conditioner. The faint sound of traffic outside. I remember noticing how still everything felt. Like time had slowed down just enough for me to think clearly. I imagined signing the report as it was. I imagined the handover ceremony, the paperwork, the quiet applause. And then, weeks later, an unexpected incident at the site. A scaffold failure, an injury, not fatal, just serious enough to trigger an investigation. Serious enough to trace back to the inspector who approved the safety margins. Me. In that scenario, I wouldn't be accused of corruption, just negligence, poor judgment in my final weeks. Enough to force an early retirement under review, enough to vacate my position quickly, and enough to justify an interim replacement. Evan, that's when the pieces stopped floating separately and locked into place. The questions about authority, the interest in timelines, the missing drawings, the copied signature, Lena's comment about money. None of it was random, none of it was emotional. It was procedural, clean, legal-looking, designed to move quietly through the system without triggering alarms until it was too late. That realization didn't come with anger. It came with a strange calm. I wasn't being misunderstood. I wasn't being challenged. I was being managed out by someone who knew the system well enough to weaponize it. I closed the report without making a note. I didn't call Evan. I didn't confront him. I didn't alert anyone. I sat there and asked myself a question I had asked countless times in other investigations. If this were anyone else's case, what would I do next? The answer was simple. I would stop treating it like a misunderstanding, and I would start treating it like intent. That was the moment I understood the most dangerous form of betrayal isn't loud or emotional. It doesn't come with accusations or raised voices. It comes wrapped in procedure, signed in familiar handwriting, filed under the right folder, and if you're not paying attention, you approve it yourself. That morning, I didn't sign anything. I shut down my computer, locked my office, and walked out into the daylight knowing one thing for certain. Whatever this was, it was no longer personal confusion. It was a plan, and it was already in motion. Once I understood what was happening, people assumed the next step was confrontation, that I stormed into Evan's office, that I demanded answers, that I tried to stop the plan by force of authority or emotion. I didn't. I did the opposite. I said nothing. No questions, no warnings, no change in how I spoke to him. I showed up to meetings on time. I answered emails with the same tone. I let him believe I was still the man he thought he could manage. Because in my line of work, silence has never meant weakness. Silence is how you listen without alerting the room. That week, I began documenting everything. Not dramatically, not obsessively, just carefully. I made copies of every version of every report. I saved timestamps. I downloaded access logs. I wrote dates in a small notebook I kept in my desk drawer, the kind inspectors use on job sites. Nothing digital at first, just ink, paper, time. 3 days later, I noticed Evan adjusting his behavior. He became more attentive, more agreeable. He volunteered to handle things he used to avoid. He checked in more often, but always casually, always with plausible reasons. If I had confronted him earlier, this is where he would have adapted faster, changed tactics, covered his tracks more cleanly. People misunderstand this part. They think silence is avoidance, that if you don't speak up, you're afraid. But in situations like this, speaking too early hands over the only leverage you have information. I had seen it dozens of times in investigations. The moment someone accuses, the other side stops acting naturally. They destroy evidence. They rehearse lies. They move money. They make phone calls you never hear about. So I waited. 2 weeks passed. I started mapping timelines. When files were edited, when Evan was on site, when certain approvals were rushed, I noticed patterns I hadn't seen before. Small gaps, overlaps that shouldn't exist. Late one night, I compared inspection schedules with his call logs. Not content, just frequency. Clusters of calls around specific milestones. Always after I'd signed something. Always before a deadline shift. It wasn't proof yet, but it was direction. That's what silence gives you. Direction. I didn't sleep much during that period. Not because I was anxious, but because my mind was finally focused. Clear. Stripped of excuses. I stopped asking myself why he would do this. That question only leads to emotion. Instead, I asked how long had this been planned? How many steps ahead was he thinking? And most importantly, who else had been affected before me? There's a common belief that staying quiet in the face of betrayal is noble suffering. That you're choosing peace over conflict. That wasn't what I was doing. I was repositioning. In behavioral psychology, there's a concept called delayed response. It's the discipline of not reacting immediately, even when your instincts are screaming. People who master it aren't cold. They're strategic. They understand that reactions reveal priorities. And I didn't want Evan to know mine. By the 3rd week, I had enough to know this wasn't impulsive. It was structured, which meant it had likely been tested before taught. That thought stayed with me. I thought about the young engineers Evan supervised. The reports that had gone through without scrutiny. The quiet transfers. The people who stopped pushing back and quietly disappeared from projects. Silence allowed me to see beyond myself. If I had confronted him the day I noticed the altered report, this would have ended as a family conflict, a misunderstanding, a closed-door agreement. Silence turned it into something else. It turned it into a case. And in every real case I've ever worked, the strongest position is held by the person who knows more than they say, for longer than expected. I didn't stop the plan yet. I let it continue. Because sometimes, the most powerful move isn't exposing the truth immediately. It's letting the truth finish revealing itself while you're ready to catch it. That was when I realized something uncomfortable, but necessary. I wasn't waiting because I was afraid to act. I was waiting because I finally understood how to win without destroying myself in the process. And once you reach that clarity, silence stops feeling like weakness. It feels like control. I thought I understood Evan after the first discovery. I thought what I was seeing was desperation, a one-time collapse under pressure, a man cornered by debt, making a reckless choice. That was my first mistake. The second realization came quietly, almost by accident. 3 weeks after I began documenting everything, I stayed late at the office. Not to investigate Evan, but to clean out old files. 38 years of inspections leave behind a lot of paper, most of it routine, most of it harmless. Then I found a name I hadn't heard in years. Daniel Brooks, a structural engineer, mid-30s at the time, talented, difficult, the kind who asked too many questions and refused to sign off on shortcuts. He had been transferred out of a major coastal project 5 years earlier, right before a surprise promotion landed Evan his first leadership role. I remembered the transfer because I had approved it myself. At the time, it seemed reasonable. Daniel had raised concerns about team cohesion. There was talk of delays, personality conflicts, nothing unusual. But now, reading the file again, something felt off. The safety complaints were vague, no specifics, no follow-up reports, and strangely, the original inspection logs attached to Daniel's objections were missing. Not lost, removed. I checked the digital archive. The deletion timestamp matched a late Sunday evening. Evan was the only one with system access that day. That was when the room went quiet. No shock, no anger, just clarity. I pulled the personnel records next. Daniel hadn't resigned. He had been reassigned pending review. That review never happened. 3 months later, his license renewal stalled. 6 months after that, he left the industry altogether. No incident, no scandal, just disappearance. I sat there for a long time, staring at the fluorescent light above my desk, listening to the hum of the building after hours. This wasn't a mistake. This was rehearsal. People who betray once might regret it. People who build systems around betrayal don't. I dug deeper. I compared Evan's project history with every unexpected transfer, every stalled approval, every quiet exit. The pattern tightened. Always the same structure, always just enough paperwork to look legitimate, always just enough pressure applied to make resistance exhausting, and always a promotion waiting on the other side. I thought about how confident Evan had been lately, how calm, how practiced. That confidence doesn't come from a first attempt. It comes from knowing it works. That night, I stopped seeing this as a family matter. This wasn't about a son turning against a father figure. This was about a method. I asked myself the question I should have asked earlier. How many times? How many careers had been quietly dismantled so one man could climb without resistance? And how many people had blamed themselves, thinking they simply weren't strong enough to survive the system? The next morning, I reviewed Evan's recent changes again. The altered report, the rushed approvals, the engineered accident that would follow my signature. It wasn't reckless. It was refined. He wasn't trying to destroy me. He was trying to replace me, cleanly, legally, permanently. I realized then that if I confronted him, he would deny everything. If I exposed him too early, this would collapse into my word against his. A powerful man accused by an aging inspector days from retirement. The system would protect itself, and he knew that. That's when the stakes changed. This was no longer about stopping one plan, it was about preventing the next one. Because men like Evan don't stop when they succeed. They stop when they're exposed. I closed the file on Daniel Brooks and wrote his name at the top of my notebook. Underneath it, I wrote a date, then another name, then another. For the first time since this began, I felt something close to resolve. Not anger, responsibility. I had pulled Evan out of failure once. I had given him access, trust, and time. What I hadn't realized was that I was also teaching him how the system bends. And now, I understood the cost of that lesson. This wasn't a personal betrayal anymore. It was a pattern. And patterns don't break themselves. They have to be documented, exposed, taken apart piece by piece. Only then do they stop. That was the moment I knew I had underestimated him. And it was also the moment I stopped underestimating what it would take to end this for good. After I uncovered the pattern, a question kept following me. Not loudly, not emotionally, quietly. If I let this play out, was I delivering justice, or was I taking revenge? I had asked that question before in my career. Many times, usually from the bench, looking down at defendants who claimed they were only doing what felt right in the moment. Teaching someone a lesson, restoring balance, making things fair. I knew how easily those words could slide into something darker. So I forced myself to slow down. I replayed the scenario again and again. If I stepped in immediately, if I confronted Evan, froze the process, pulled rank, I could stop the immediate danger. The staged accident would never happen. I would finish my term quietly. The system would move on, but Evan would remain. He would adjust, learn, try again later, and the people beneath him would keep paying the price. If I did nothing, if I signed the documents, let events unfold, I would be allowing harm to occur. Even if the harm was something Evan himself had set in motion. That thought sat heavy with me. There is a thin line between allowing consequences and causing suffering. I didn't want to cross it. Late one night, I stood alone in the warehouse where this all began. The lights were off except for one emergency lamp near the loading bay. I could hear the water outside, slapping against the docks, the low metallic groan of cranes in the distance. That space had seen decades of work, quiet labor, real risk, real people. I asked myself a different question. What am I adding to this situation? Am I introducing harm, or am I simply refusing to block it? That distinction matters more than people realize. Revenge requires intent to cause pain. Justice requires restraint. I wasn't setting traps. I wasn't escalating the plan. I wasn't pushing Evan further than he was already willing to go. Everything unfolding was his design, his timing, his signatures. I was only deciding whether to stand in front of it or step aside and document it properly. In court, I had learned this the hard way. Sometimes the most unjust outcome comes from well-intended interference. When systems are bypassed to protect individuals, the damage doesn't disappear, it spreads. Covering for the wrong person doesn't save them. It teaches them they're untouchable. That realization brought no comfort, just clarity. I remembered a case from years earlier. A senior official caught manipulating safety reports. His supervisor quietly reassigned him, hoping to avoid scandal. 2 years later, a bridge inspection failed. 3 people died. No one ever named the first decision as the cause. But it was. I didn't want to be that supervisor. I also didn't want to become someone who justified cruelty under the banner of principle. So I drew a line for myself. I would not intervene in a way that increased harm, but I would not shield Evan from the consequences of actions he had already chosen. That meant staying within the system, letting procedures run, preserving evidence, allowing accountability to arrive through lawful channels, not faster, not slower, exactly as it should. I monitored every step, every update, every deviation. If at any point someone else was put in immediate danger, I was ready to act. But until then, my role wasn't executioner, it was witness. This is the part people struggle with. They want justice to look dramatic, immediate, satisfying. But real justice is often uncomfortable because it requires patience. It requires letting go of the desire to feel right and focusing instead on being correct. I didn't feel powerful during that time. I felt exposed. I questioned myself constantly. Was I doing this because it was right, or because I was hurt? The only answer that mattered was this: every action I took reduced future harm rather than increasing present pain. That's where the line is. Justice stops when it begins to serve ego. Revenge begins when pain becomes the point. I wasn't interested in watching Evan suffer. I was interested in making sure he couldn't do this again to anyone. When I finally accepted that distinction, the noise in my head quieted. The choice became clear. I would let the truth surface fully. I would not rush it. I would not interfere with it. And when the system finally spoke, it wouldn't be because I forced it to. It would be because the evidence left it no other choice. That's not vengeance. That's accountability. And sometimes, the hardest part of justice is trusting it enough not to interfere even when you're standing right in the middle of it. When Evan finally spoke, it wasn't in anger. It wasn't defiant. It was tired. The confession didn't happen in a dramatic room or under pressure. It happened late, after everything had already surfaced, after the documents, after the timelines, after the silence had done its work. He didn't look at me at first. He stared at the floor and said, "I never thought it would get this far." That sentence told me more than any excuse could. He talked about money first, always money, credit lines stacked on top of each other, a business venture he'd tried to hide, payments he missed, then lied about, numbers that grew faster than he could control. But money wasn't the real weight. The real weight was failure. "I couldn't let you see me like that," he said, "after everything you did for me." That was the moment I understood something most people miss. This wasn't about greed alone. It was about shame. Evan had been raised in structure, discipline, high expectations. He had grown up watching me hold standards that didn't bend for anyone. He learned early what success looked like and what failure cost. When he was young, that discipline gave him direction. As an adult, it became a mirror he couldn't face. Every setback felt amplified. Every mistake felt final. And instead of asking for help, he started hiding. That's where the story changes for people like him. Gratitude and resentment can grow in the same place. He didn't hate me for helping him. He hated himself for needing it. Over time, that feeling twisted. Support began to feel like surveillance. Guidance felt like judgment. And my presence, steady, consistent, unimpressed by shortcuts, became a reminder of everything he wasn't living up to. So he rewrote the story. In his version, he wasn't betraying someone who saved him. He was reclaiming power from someone who had always stood above him. That's the dangerous pivot. When insecurity becomes narrative, morality follows convenience. He told himself he deserved what he was taking, that the system owed him, that the people in his way were obstacles, not lives. That's how good intentions rot quietly. Not because someone wakes up wanting to do harm, but because they can't tolerate being seen as weak. I listened without interrupting. Not because I agreed, but because I needed to hear how far he'd gone inside his own justification. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was asking to be understood. And I did understand. Understanding doesn't mean absolution. It means clarity. I told him something then. Calmly. "You didn't become this way because you were raised poorly," I said. "You became this way because you never learned how to fail honestly." That silence afterward was heavier than any accusation. People often ask why someone who was treated well becomes ungrateful. The answer is uncomfortable. When support replaces accountability, some people stop seeing help as a gift and start seeing it as proof they can't stand on their own. That feeling corrodes quietly, and if it's never addressed, it looks for an exit. Evan didn't lack values. He lacked the courage to be imperfect in front of the person whose respect he wanted most. So he chose control instead. Control over perception, control over outcome, control over me. I didn't argue with him. I didn't raise my voice. There was no satisfaction in watching him explain himself, only confirmation. This wasn't a villain exposed, it was a pattern completed. He wasn't driven by hatred, he was driven by fear of being small. And fear, when given access to power and a system that can be bent, becomes far more destructive than anger ever could. That's the part people rarely talk about. Ungratefulness doesn't always come from entitlement. Sometimes it comes from a wounded ego that never learned how to ask for help without feeling erased. Still, none of that changed what he did. Pain explains behavior. It doesn't excuse it. I left that conversation knowing something important. If I had stepped in earlier, rescued him again, covered for him one more time, I would have reinforced the very weakness he was running from. And the next betrayal would have been worse. Some people don't need more grace. They need limits. And sometimes, the most honest thing you can do for someone who was raised well but chose wrongly is to stop protecting them from the consequences of who they've decided to become. That's not cruelty, that's truth. And truth, even when it hurts, is the last gift you can give without lying to yourself. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make threats. I didn't confront Evan again. Instead, I made a call I had avoided for years. Frank Dalton answered on the second ring. He had been the state's chief supervisor long before I was promoted, and long after most people thought he'd retired. He was the kind of man who never needed to announce authority. When he spoke, systems moved. We met 3 days later. No offices, no conference room. Just a small table at the back of a quiet diner off the highway. Coffee that had been reheated too many times. No pleasantries. I placed the box between us. Inside were copies, timelines, audit trails, cross-referenced signatures, file numbers, dates, names, everything I had collected while staying silent. Frank didn't react. He opened the folder slowly, page by page, the way people do when they already understand what they're about to see. After 10 minutes, he looked up and asked only one question. How long has this been going on? I told him the earliest date I could prove. Not estimate. Prove. He nodded once. That was it. No anger, no outrage, no sympathy, just confirmation. From that moment on, it wasn't my story anymore. The investigation didn't announce itself. There were no raids, no dramatic suspensions, no press releases. That's not how real systems work when they're functioning properly. They start quietly. Requests for records that seem routine. Emails that look procedural. Calendar invites marked internal review. People don't panic at first. They assume it's a formality. That's when the truth surfaces. Within 2 weeks, permits were rechecked. Inspection histories were reopened. Names I had never mentioned started appearing in reports. 3 weeks later, a subcontractor was flagged for inconsistencies that had been ignored for years. 6 weeks after that, a pattern emerged so clean it couldn't be argued away. What struck me most wasn't how fast it moved. It was how little anyone talked. No one called me to negotiate. No one asked me to reconsider. No one accused me of betrayal. Because when a system is strong, it doesn't need emotion to justify action. It doesn't care who raised whom. It doesn't care who trusted whom. It cares about evidence. I stayed out of the way. That part was important. I didn't attend meetings. I didn't offer commentary. I didn't give advice. I had already done my part. People assume justice is loud. It isn't. Justice is paperwork completed correctly. Justice is procedures followed without favoritism. Justice is letting processes do what personal relationships can't. At one point, Frank called me back, not to update me, just to say, "You did the right thing by stepping aside." That mattered more than any verdict, because the temptation to interfere to guide outcomes, to protect feelings, to soften consequences is where justice turns into control. I didn't want control. I wanted truth to stand on its own. As the investigation widened, Evan stopped calling, Lena stopped texting, colleagues avoided eye contact. That told me everything I needed to know. When people grow quiet around you, it's often because the story they believed can't survive scrutiny. I never once asked how it would end. That wasn't my role. I already knew the outcome wouldn't feel like victory. When the system finally speaks, it doesn't shout, it doesn't humiliate, it doesn't explain itself. It simply moves forward, and whoever can't move with it gets left behind. That's the part people misunderstand. The strongest response to betrayal isn't revenge. It's restraint. It's choosing structure over impulse. It's trusting that when truth is documented carefully enough, you don't have to defend it. You just have to release it. And once I handed that box across the table, I felt something unexpected. Not relief. Clarity. Because from that moment on, whatever happened next wouldn't be shaped by my anger, my disappointment, or my history. It would be shaped by something far more powerful, a system that didn't need me to speak for it. And when systems work the way they're meant to, silence isn't weakness, it's authority. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They came in pieces. First, Evan's license was suspended, quietly. No announcement, just a formal notice delivered in a plain envelope, the kind that never brings good news. 37 pages, dates highlighted, sections underlined, no opinions, just violations. A month later, the federal inquiry followed. That one was heavier. Different paper, different tone, different stakes. I didn't read it. I didn't need to. By then, the outcome had already taken shape. People often imagine consequences as dramatic moments. Raised voices, public shame, a final confrontation. That isn't how it happened. Evan stopped being invited to meetings. His access badges were deactivated without explanation. His name disappeared from project updates, not crossed out, just absent. That absence said more than any accusation ever could. Lena came by once. She stood at my door longer than she knocked. When I opened it, she didn't cry. She didn't argue. She just looked tired in a way that sleep can't fix. She asked one question. How long did you know I told her the truth? Longer than I wanted to. She nodded. That was all. No anger, no denial, just the sound of something breaking quietly inside a person who finally understands what they've been protecting. Some truths arrive too late to change outcomes, but just in time to end illusions. That was hers. As for me, I finished my term exactly as scheduled. No extensions, no speeches, no statements. On my last day, I cleared my desk in under 15 minutes. A notebook, a pen, one framed photo I never kept facing outward. I left the keys where they'd always been left, and I walked out. People asked why I didn't stay longer, why I didn't explain myself, why I didn't defend my legacy. The answer was simple. Nothing I could say would make the truth clearer. Nothing I could add would make the outcome fairer. When systems work, they don't require commentary. I didn't leave with bitterness. That surprises people. I didn't leave with relief either. What I felt was distance. Distance from a version of myself who believed loyalty could substitute for accountability. Distance from a relationship that no longer shared the same moral ground. That's the part most people struggle to accept. Not every ending is fueled by hatred. Some endings happen because values drift so far apart that staying becomes a form of self-betrayal. I didn't hate Evan. I still don't. But I could no longer stand beside him without standing against everything I had enforced for nearly 4 decades. That's a price no one else can pay for you. Not family, Not history, not love. Everyone involved paid something. Evan lost his career. Lena lost the future she thought she was building. And I lost a relationship I once believed would outlast my own position. But loss isn't always punishment. Sometimes it's alignment. Sometimes it's the cost of choosing a line you refuse to cross, even when crossing it would be easier. When I think back now, I don't replay the investigation. I replay the silence afterward, the quiet that follows when the truth has settled and there's nothing left to argue. That quiet is honest. It doesn't ask for forgiveness. It doesn't seek applause. It just remains. And in that quiet, I knew I had done the only thing that allowed me to leave with myself intact. Some relationships end with shouting, others end with paperwork, and some end simply because there is no longer a shared understanding of right and wrong. Those endings don't make headlines, but they last longer, because no one can carry the cost of compromised values for you. And once you understand that, walking away isn't weakness, it's the final responsibility. There's a lesson people often misunderstand about this story. They assume it's about betrayal. It isn't. Betrayal was just the symptom. The real lesson came much later, when I had enough distance to see the pattern clearly. For most of my career, people described me as kind, fair, patient. The man who listened longer than he spoke, the one who gave second chances. I took pride in that. But kindness without structure is just exposure, and exposure invites misuse. What protected me in the end wasn't anger, it wasn't cleverness, and it certainly wasn't confrontation. It was system, boundaries written down long before they were needed, evidence collected quietly, without emotion attached to it. Law applied the same way it had always been applied, even when it hurt someone I cared about. And finally, the willingness to walk away. That last one matters more than people realize. Most people think strength looks like staying and fixing things, holding relationships together at all costs, absorbing damage quietly and calling it loyalty. That's not strength, that's delay. I've learned that truly dangerous people aren't loud. They don't threaten. They don't explode. They remain calm while documenting everything. They don't seek revenge. They remove protection, and that's the part people fear most. A kind person with no system can be manipulated indefinitely. A kind person with a system becomes immovable, not because they fight harder, but because they stop bending. I didn't win because I outplayed anyone. I won because I didn't step outside the rules I had enforced for decades. The same procedures, the same thresholds, the same consequences, no exceptions for family, no shortcuts for history, no emotional discounts. That consistency did more damage than any confrontation ever could. Because when systems speak, there's nowhere left to argue, no villain to blame, no personal attack to defend against, just timelines, documents, decisions, and a quiet ending that can't be reversed. People ask me now if I regret being so patient in the beginning. I do, but not for the reason they expect. I regret confusing kindness with trust. Trust should always be conditional. Kindness can be generous. Trust must be earned and constantly maintained. When those two are treated as the same thing, someone always pays for it later. If there's one thing I'd pass on from all of this, it's this: never rely on your character alone to protect you. Character without structure invites exploitation. Structure without character becomes cruelty. But when the two exist together, you don't need to raise your voice. You don't need to threaten. You don't even need to explain. You simply stop shielding wrongdoing, and the rest unfolds on its own. That's why the most dangerous person in any system isn't the loud enforcer. It's the quiet one who understands the rules, respects them, and knows exactly when to stop bending them. Not because they want to destroy anyone, but because they refuse to destroy themselves to keep the peace. That kind of danger doesn't shout, it doesn't rush, it waits, and when it acts, it does so once, cleanly, permanently. That's not vengeance, that's integrity, finally backed by structure. And once you understand that, you stop fearing conflict, because you realize the real power was never in confrontation, it was in preparation, and in knowing when to walk away without looking back. If you're listening to this and something in your chest feels tight, I want you to stay with me for a moment, because this part isn't about my story anymore, it's about yours. Somewhere right now, there's someone watching this who recognizes the pattern. Not exactly the details, but the feeling, the quiet discomfort, the sense that something isn't right, even though you keep telling yourself it will pass. You might be working beside someone you once trusted. You might be protecting a family member. You might be carrying information that feels too heavy to name out loud. And you keep thinking, if I just handle this myself, no one else has to get hurt. I thought that too. Here's the truth I wish someone had said to me earlier. Don't handle it alone. Isolation doesn't make you strong, it makes you vulnerable. When you keep everything inside your head, the situation controls you. The moment you write things down, share them with the right people, or bring them into a process larger than yourself, the balance shifts. The second thing is harder. Don't keep secrets that damage you. There's a difference between privacy and silence that eats away at your judgment. Secrets distort time. They make weeks feel like minutes and years disappear before you realize what you've lost. I watched myself normalize things I never would have accepted before, simply because I was tired, because I didn't want to be the one who caused trouble, because I told myself loyalty mattered more than clarity. That's how people get trapped, not by one big decision, but by 1,000 small ones they never talk about. And the last thing I want to say to you is this. Set boundaries early, even when it feels uncomfortable, especially then. Boundaries aren't punishments. They're signals. They tell people how to treat you, and they tell you when to step back. If someone reacts badly to a reasonable boundary, pay attention. That reaction is information. You don't owe anyone unlimited access to your integrity. You don't owe explanations for protecting yourself. And you don't owe your future to someone else's comfort. There's a moment in every situation like this where you sense a door closing. You feel it quietly. It doesn't announce itself. That's the moment people ignore. They stay longer. They hope harder. They sacrifice more. And later, they call it bad luck. It isn't. Leaving at the right time is not failure. It's judgment. It's choosing not to burn yourself down just to keep a fragile peace intact. If you're standing at that edge right now, wondering whether walking away means you've lost, I want you to hear this clearly. Walking away with your values intact is a form of winning most people never talk about. You don't need to destroy anyone. You don't need to prove you were right. You don't need applause. You need your clarity back. So if this story resonated with you, take it as a signal. Talk to someone you trust. Document what matters. Stop carrying weight that isn't yours alone. And give yourself permission to step away before the cost becomes permanent. If this helped you put words to something you've been feeling, let me know by liking the video, sharing it with someone who might need it, and subscribing to the channel. And if you're comfortable, comment where you're watching from. Not so I can track numbers, but so you know you're not facing this alone.